without further ado, I'd like to introduce Randy Schwartz. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vanessa. And thank you other folks for being here today for the talk by Dan Freidus on Expatriate Cookbooks. And a special welcome to the actually larger number of folks who are watching online. Welcome to everyone. I'm Randy Schwartz from the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor. I want to also thank our host for today's program, the Ann Arbor District Library. They provide us this presentation room as well as promotional and technical support so we can share these programs far and wide across several time zones by live streaming them and by recording and posting them on the library's YouTube channel. For the new viewers here today, I'd like to briefly introduce you to the Culinary Historians. We're an informal group bringing together all sorts of people interested in the history and culture of food and cooking. We were founded in 1983, and new members are always welcome. We have about 150 members currently, around half of them here in Michigan, and the other half spread across North America and overseas. Besides these monthly talks, we also have twice yearly participatory theme meals for members only. Our theme meal last month was on the Gilded Age. If you're not a member of CHAA, we'd love to have you join. Membership is only $25 a year for an individual or a couple, and it includes a subscription to our quarterly magazine, Repast. A postal subscription to Repast by itself is only $20 a year, no matter what country you live in. By the way, anyone can write for Repast. Just contact me, I'm the editor. Contact me via the CHAA website, culinaryhistoriansannarbor.org, and we'll talk over some ideas. If you'd like to join our group or just to subscribe to Repast, you can find the information on that website. Click on the membership tab there. You can also follow us on Facebook. Just search for Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor. Or if you're here in person today, you can pick up a membership form on the center table there on the side after the Q&A session. By the way, for those watching this online via YouTube, if you'd like to ask the speaker a question, you can type it into the chat section of YouTube and we'll try to convey that to the speaker. After the Q&A today, for those here in person, we have some American expatriate style Coca-Cola and a dish for you to try called sweet potatoes with peanuts. It's a baked pudding made using a recipe from a cookbook compiled in 2011 by the Peace Corps volunteers in the Caribbean region. So help yourselves to some refreshments after the program. Our next talk will be on Sunday, February 15th, same time, same room, by the University of Michigan anthropology professor, Alyssa Paredes. Dr. Paredes has explored the bananas consumed in post-war Japan, how the preference there for very sweet bananas arose when Japan had colonial rule over parts of China, and how in the 1980s, export growers in the Philippines discovered that the sweetest bananas could be cultivated at extremely high altitudes. So the talk is titled, Bananas Above the Clouds, How the Japanese Taste for Sweetness Transformed the Philippine Highlands. So we look forward to that talk in February, 4 weeks from today. And now, finally, I want to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Daniel Freidus of Ann Arbor has been pursuing a passion for collecting cookbooks for decades. Originally from the town of Harrison in Westchester County, New York, he majored in biology at Amherst College and also won a book collecting contest at the library there while still an undergraduate. He earned a PhD in biology here at the University of Michigan, later working at U of M as an academic advisor for 20 years until his retirement in 2018. On the side, Dan has been collecting. For example, he collects early American coins and paper money, and especially books and other literature about American money and finance. He also collects rare Jewish cookbooks, and in the past few years, he's been gradually donating that collection to the New York Public Library. I'm curious where he finds all these books. So without further ado, would you please join me in welcoming Dan Freidus.
Thank you, Randy. Thanks to the library and to all the library staff who've made this possible. Bookstock is a great charity book sale every spring. They have 250,000 books, and at least 1% of them are worth bringing home. It's in the Detroit burbs. If you Google Bookstock as one word, you will find it. So yeah, I've collected for a while, and actually, can we go right to the slides? And each of my collections has in part been funded by keeping my eyes out for really good books that I don't care about. And one day, I was showing a bunch of books to a dealer here in Ann Arbor, who happens to be in the room, and while he was doing that, I was looking through his inventory. There we go, thanks. And he had this book, which, if you look at the top half, looks like sort of a pretty ordinary community cookbook from a church. I noticed that it's from an Episcopal church in Cairo, and I did not know there were Episcopal churches in Cairo, so I flipped through it. And actually, as an aside, I should mention I am not an anthropologist, a sociologist, a trained historian, or a polyglot. So I will probably say something at some point today that will make someone laugh or want to correct me. I would love to be corrected after the fact. There's enough stuff here to talk about the cookbooks rather than my lack of knowledge that let me know later. So this cookbook was interesting, and I thought, like, oh, are there others like this? And I kept an eye out, and after a couple of years, I had 50 or 100, and happened to be having lunch, a great Filipino kamayan meal in Toronto with a friend of my wife's who's a history professor, who I, at the time, did not realize did food history. And as I described what I was doing with these books, he said, those would be great for research. There is no collection of those in any library. So I decided, oh, I'm recently retired. Let me see if I could get a bunch. And because it's not a recognized genre, there aren't people looking for them, so very often they're quite inexpensive. And I'm going to run through a whole bunch just to give you a sense of the things I found and try to end early enough that there's time for questions. And I don't have all the books with me, but I have some of them, and the library has provided a document camera so I can flip open a book and everyone would be able to see it. If you have questions about any specific book, let me know. I may be able to show it to you later. But looking inside this book, it's not just a cookbook from Kansas or Ann Arbor. These people living in Cairo were engaged with the community and interested in at least 17 pages worth of Egyptian recipes. I'm going to show you some of the newest, oldest. In this case, this is the expat cookbook produced closest to Ann Arbor in my collection. The Lycée International School was founded when Renault bought part of American Motors Corporation and moved 50 French employees to Southfield, Michigan. And some executives at the car company convinced a private school that they would give it money if they would convert their curriculum to French. And as a small private school, as soon as they heard money, my guess is, they jumped at it. So they had 130 students, 25 or 30 of whom were either children of Renault employees or children of French diplomats or diplomats from French-speaking countries living in the Detroit area. And the curriculum was bilingual, and all the French students studied English, the American students studied French, and all the other academic subjects were taught in both languages, and you take it in your non-native language as soon as you were able. I have not figured out if the school existed past Renault's ownership of AMC. My guess is it may have, but probably changed names. And actually, the book was by the French parents of the school. So it is a French cookbook from Southfield, Michigan. The oldest cookbooks I have are from the Canal Zone in 1910, a book I've only had for a week, and a book that I probably had for 4 or 5 years from 1918, Red Cross volunteers in Nanking, China. And one of the most interesting things about this cookbook is there's one chapter that basically is introduced saying, as a Red Cross volunteer, you're on a budget. Exotic ingredients for comfort food are either hard to get or expensive. You should learn to cook Chinese food. And so that chapter is one of the earliest effectively one of the earliest Chinese cookbooks in English that exists. And if anyone is interested in Chinese cookbooks in English, what used to be State University of New York at Stony Brook, now Stony Brook University, acquired a collection of at least 10,000 items that are about Chinese cooking in English. When the person who gave that collection wrote the standard bibliography, or should I just say the bibliography of Chinese cookbooks in English, she knew this book existed, but she did not have a copy. I have fairly good search skills and was lucky enough, both lucky and skilled enough to find it in a group lot of miscellaneous Red Cross materials on eBay, including 7 first aid guides and this. So here's some of the recipes that clearly got used given all the annotations. And here are 2 of the newest cookbooks I have. After the war in Ukraine started, returned Peace Corps volunteers got together to do a fundraising project and produce this very well-produced book, both in terms of content and physical production, in 2023. And the book on the right is from a NATO air base that's largely run by the Americans, but has people from, I think, 14 countries there in Sicily. And so the people from each country contributed recipes from home. And that's from 2022. And then the ones we just saw had pretty high production values. The other extreme is some of these. In 1961 in Berlin, the Non-Commissioned Officers' Wives Club produced a cookbook. It is mimeographed on one, and actually I can't remember 20th century duplication processes well enough to remember what most of the black ones are. It might be Mimeo or something similar to that, but they are printed on one side of the page on really crappy paper. This book was at one point bound because there's a piece of yarn, but none of the pages have either page numbers or holes in them. So I'm just guessing that these recipes came with that book cover, but I can't guarantee it. I have no idea if it's complete. I've never seen another reference to it existing. Besides being here for physical production, that book's interesting because as someone who did not grow up in a military family, one thing that I've learned from these books is the social structure of military bases. So you will rarely see a cookbook put out by families across a base. You'll sometimes see cookbooks from enlisted families, non-commissioned officers' families, or officers. Apparently, social circles are fairly separate. Many people have learned that piece of information without collecting expat cookbooks. That's how I learned it. The Kenyan Women's Association of the United Arab Emirates in 1990 put out a cookbook that, despite the fact that if it had been put out in Ann Arbor, cut and paste would have been something someone did with a mouse. This book was typed, the master was typed, things were cut and paste physically, and then someone must have had access to a photocopy machine. But you can see like black marks at the border between where cut and paste pieces were. And what I first thought was 1970s ASCII art done with a typewriter. But again, this book turns out to be from 1990. And it tells you something about what technology was available to people. And again, very high production quality. The American Women's Literary Club of Lima, Peru, has been putting out cookbooks for about 70 years, every 5 or 10 years. The large one is sometime in the last 10 years, and if you saw this in Barnes & Noble's, you would think it physically looked nicer than most of the books in Barnes & Noble's. Another group that often has high production quality are the families of petroleum workers. And Stavanger, Norway, is a petroleum town. There are multiple cookbooks. The Mobile Wives had the best printing and binding. Back to Lima, Peru on the left, the Peruvian cookery pamphlet on the lower left is probably 50 or 60 years old. I know it's put out by the American Women's Literary Club, but don't have a lot of information about it. I've seen 1 or 2 other copies. I don't know if there are any in libraries. And that's one of the things, is that many of these books were produced for small communities, for the community, in very small quantities. And on occasion, I've had conversations with book dealers who know about the supply part but forget about the demand part. And I have had to bite my tongue at least once, so I didn't say, yeah, I know this book is rare. You want to know what's just as rare? People who care. Because I realize that's never going to make it easier for me to buy a book. These are also about production quality, and the CIA cookbook is there because I want to mention what it means to be part of a community varies depending on what that community is. The CIA cookbook does not have the name of the contributor next to each recipe. In fact, there are no names of any CIA employees in the CIA cookbook. And it makes you think about what it means to be part of a community where anonymity is a big part of the community. So they were able to pull off, and you can't see it, but this is a hardbound book, very professionally produced, and it is the predecessor to the book titled More Spies, Black Ties, and Mango Pies. So they're also organized. The Kitchens of Eastern Arabia, what you can't see from this photo is it's an 800-page cookbook. So there's over 1,000 recipes in it. There are many newspapers that do not have that many proofreaders. But one of the other things that makes this book unique is about 2/3 of the way down, 2 registered dietitians check the nutritional balance or information on all these recipes. I'm not sure what they did after they checked it, but to have 2 dietitians checking 1,000 recipes was a non-trivial contribution. Sometimes books either say they're for expats or they make it pretty clear. And so places where Americans try to retire inexpensively have a number of them, but it's not that many. I only have a half dozen books or so that have the word expat in the title. Selena Royal, or Royal, I don't know exactly how you pronounce her name, was apparently an American film star who retired to Mexico and took up journalism, and she wrote a column for a newspaper and also wrote A Gringa's Guide to Mexican Cooking. There are a handful of books, often for different parts of the world, about becoming an expat. Gringo Girl I'd Kill for Meatloaf, I just love the title, the cover. And then there's missionaries. And missionary cookbooks, some that have missionary in the title are not by or for missionaries. They're just from evangelical groups that use the word missionary in them. Sometimes they're not by or for missionaries. They're just fundraising efforts from church groups that give money to missionary organizations. And so in the sense of being a book by or for expats, they don't all fit. This one is by and for the missionary ladies of Venezuela. And I think I've got, yes. And one of the things that's a great hint that it's not just for folks in the US is that the rhubarb cake shows that it's okay to substitute green mango. Because rhubarb is, I'm guessing, is not widely available in Venezuela. And then this I just didn't know where to put, so I threw it in here. The FAA Associates, which is the Federal Airline Agency, or Federal Aviation Administration, has offices in Brussels, presumably to coordinate with either NATO or EU. I don't know. I assume it's mainly about civilian air travel. But it's interesting that the FAA Associates is a name change because it used to be called the FAA Wives Club. And only 4 years later, in the 90s, they realized that was antiquated. Not all organizations have come to the same conclusion yet. But it was interesting to see both that they did change the name and they thought this was worth mentioning. Foreseeing the time where there may be husbands, parents, as well as wives who need a little aid in acclimating. Another group is Peace Corps volunteers often produce books in very small quantity for fairly small communities because it's often Peace Corps volunteers producing a book for the next group of volunteers that will replace them. The one on the right is from 1967, the one on the left, I am pretty sure is from the 60s. It mentions someone who worked in, this is Peace Corps Volunteers of Afghanistan, as you can sort of see in the lower right. The PCA is about Afghanistan. The introduction mentions someone, the book is dedicated to someone who worked there in 1964 and uses the past tense. But there's another edition or another book with the same title put out in 1970. So I'm guessing this is between 65 and 69, but I have not been able to verify it because no library reports owning a copy. And I've never seen another copy. So the stains are meaningless to me if I can find a book like this. Whereas in Turkey, they had access to much better technology. That's typeset. But the recipe, and Peace Corps books often have two sections, or some of the introductions talk about how we're explicitly thinking about two things, your safety and your health. And so there'll be things about how to cook. This mentions the person, on the left is the mention about the person, and on the right talking about health and safety. I'm going to rattle through some of these quickly because it was hard to narrow it down to a number that I could show you in 45 minutes. And I'd like to leave time for questions. This, again, a mimeograph production from Niger, a Peace Corps volunteer in Niger. If you look at the top, it says cooking in Niger. The book was too fragile for me to open it enough so you could actually see the whole word. And again, a book scarce enough, I've never seen or heard of another copy. I don't know if there were 10 made or 20. This picture is really just here to show that besides health and safety and comfort food, most Peace Corps cookbooks do include a lot of local recipes. And many people are remote enough that their access to ingredients to cook comfort food is infrequent. And I also think some of it's the mindset of Peace Corps volunteers. And that's one of the things that I think these books, they tell you something about the mindset of people who are living abroad for various reasons. And the reasons vary dramatically. And one of the things I've learned is things I thought I would have been able to predict don't show clear enough, obvious patterns, which may say more about assumptions I was jumping to than about the people living abroad. Here, more Peace Corps volunteer cookbooks. The one from Ghana, it's interesting because it's fairly well produced, even though pretty simple. No indication when it's from. I've seen a reference to another copy existing, but I don't know if it's a reference to this same. Oh no, actually, it definitely is not this copy, but we know there's at least 2 copies out there. That's that. The one on the lower left, the Himalayan Gourmet from 1967, was written by a Peace Corps volunteer. And again, not access to good printing or good materials, but a very nicely written book. And well written enough that in 1985, they did another edition of the book with access to much better printing. And in fact, the one on the lower right is one of the only Peace Corps books, or one of the only expat cookbooks I've seen, but definitely the only Peace Corps volunteer one I've seen that has a dust jacket. And the recipes are similar, but it's not 100% identical. And this is the Ghana cookbook and the later edition of the Nepalese cookbook, just to show you that there are local recipes. But I like the contumely with corned beef, which may not be traditional anywhere. And another, so this, as far as I can know, Peace Corps cookbook from Sierra Leone, translated to Where There Is No McDonald's. And this one, let me see if I have a date for this. I don't think I do. But I'm guessing 1960s, maybe 1970. And this one has a section on how to deal with stoves, and notice it's how to deal with the Russian and Chinese stoves that you're likely to have. At the other end of people who are sent abroad, funded by the US government, at least in terms of comfort and lifestyle, are diplomats, or people working in foreign service of any sort. And there are a number of individual books, some of which are cookbooks or cookbooks interspersed with memoirs, and a few of them, like the one on the lower right, is written, compiled by the association. So that one is about the sense of community that people have, even though many of them may have not served together or may have only met 1 or 2 days a year. So these are interesting books. This one I put here because I thought that May Beatty was the wife of an English diplomat. I was incorrect. I was thinking of someone else. She was Scottish, educated in Canada for undergrad, and then went back to the UK and got a PhD, although I have not seen anything that specifies what her doctorate is in. But her husband was a biomedical scientist who got a position with the Pasteur Institute in Baghdad. And on the left, you see the 1946 book that's said to be the first cookbook put out there in almost 200 years, and definitely the first one in English, but possibly the first one in any language in a couple hundred years. But and it went through 3 editions. So on the left is the hardbound from 1946. Then from the 1950s, and then I think a 3rd edition came out in 1961. And she wasn't talking about how to eat fancy food in diplomatic circles or academic circles. It was, what is the food of this country? This is something I didn't learn about in Scotland. This is interesting, and I can't find a cookbook. And so she spent time studying the food. She lived there for 9 years and put out an excellent cookbook. She also became an expert in so-called Persian rugs and wrote at least one reference on them and went back to Oxford where she did research and became involved and I think built the collection at the Ashmolean Museum of rugs. And the cookbooks are wonderful, but at least in this country scarce, and I think quite possibly scarce, period. Back to diplomats. The families of the staff of the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City put out El Cookbook, which is bilingual and mostly American, so-called American recipes. But you'll see on the lower left, page 231, there's about 20 pages of Mexican recipes. And when I talk about not having academic training in relevant fields, talking about colonialism is where it would show most if I were to keep talking too much. But there's a way to think of colonialists as expats of a sort. There are many who would not see themselves as immigrants. And then it gets complicated as countries become independent, what the relationship is with people of the former colonizers. So the Kenya Settlers Cookery Book first came out in 1928 by the Church of Scotland Women's Guild. This is a 1958 printing on the left. The one on the right is a 1987 printing of the 1970 edition. They kept printing this for at least 60 years. And I've seen enough copies listed online for sale. I'm pretty sure 1987 was not the last printing. But as soon as I had a clearly post-colonial, modern edition, I stopped doing the bibliographic information to look for every edition. But it's just curious to think about what from this 1928 book was still considered relevant for lives of anyone in 1987. But enough was. I didn't remember the size of the screen. Let's just suffice it to say the 2 editions are almost identical. The Congo Cookery Book from, I think, around 1942, this one was published. This particular copy is inscribed from one missionary to another. Mrs. Samuel Entz, I think her name was Leona, died either 2000 or 2005. But in 1953, one of the Schmallenbergers hoped that she would enjoy using that book while in Congo. And it's basically European cooking with the acknowledgement of local produce and information on how to get a taxi in Leopoldville. I'm not focusing on the ads. The ads in community cookbooks and expat cookbooks alone would be an interesting thing to delve into. Who supports them, what the connections are. There are books that are undated that I have been able to date because they talk about the new model of Ford coming out, and then not being a car guy, I still know how to research things and find out, oh, or actually it's better with Chevy because they had more different models in different years. Like there's one book that because the Chevy 6 came out in 1927, this book is between 1927 and 28 because after 28 you wouldn't talk about it as a new car. This is, because we have people online, I'm not going to ask people to guess, but this book is from 1969, The American Women of in Zambia. And what's intriguing about this one is one page of Zambian recipes. And I use the word recipes plural in its most restrictive sense because, oh no, it is 3, not 2. Okay, on the right side is that page 89 with 3 Zambian recipes in a 90-page book. And coffee cake. I have at least 4 or 5 books called Stuffed Camel. There are certain things that people just have such stereotypical ideas, and camels and elephants loom large in the minds of many Europeans and Americans. And we will come back to camels and elephants. But these two are because, back to the thing of like a book with only 1 page of local recipes, expats often want comfort food. So whether it's Havana in the mid-50s or let me double check that I'm correct. Yeah, this is Saudi Arabia in 1982. The book on the right is published by the women of Bell Canada, who are apparently setting up a phone system in Saudi Arabia. So a dish I had never heard of until I moved to the Midwest for grad school is Johnny Marzetti, which is sort of like chili mac or Hungarian so-called goulash. It's macaroni with ground beef and tomato sauce and cheese. And it's a specialty, apparently, of Columbus, Ohio, where people claim it was invented, except they say it was invented by people associated with the Marzetti Food Company, but the company historian says there's no evidence that we had anything to do with it. So I don't know the history of Johnny Marzetti. There's a book out there waiting to be written if someone really wants to delve into this dish, because here we have even a single, well, it could be Joe Marzetti, Johnny Mozetti, but in Havana, the people assembling this book couldn't just pick one recipe because apparently people feel so strongly about what ingredients should be in Johnny Marzetti, they had to put in all 4 versions. And Americans in Saudi Arabia also thought Johnny Musetti, which they say is Italian. And sometimes, the fact that this says Italian brings up something that I see in many of the books from the 50s is recipes for Italian spaghetti, as opposed to the other kind. But in the 1950s, that was considered ethnic food, and so it's often in the foreign recipe section. And so here, yeah, 4 recipes that are different versions of this. And except for the fact that one has green peppers, I don't know how, oh, it's 2 recipes. I forgot, this book is bilingual. It took me a second to realize I'm reading multiple languages. And back to camels and brand names. Comfort food is not always about being the best food. It's about comfort. And so people want familiar ingredients. And in some places, employers or others will go to great lengths to keep people happy. So in the UAE, if you want to make strawberry shortcake, you can get Cool Whip and Twinkies. And there are people who have traveled 4,000 or 5,000 miles to the UAE, but this is what they're looking to make and what they're going to bring to the potluck next week. And I'm not judging. I have eaten Twinkies. So it's not about judging that, but it's sort of, well, yeah, it is. Sorry. I'm sorry. And also Saudi Arabia. So at the National Methanol Company, Jubail, which is largely a petroleum city, or at least for the expats, there are many, many expats working in petroleum, not at Ibn Sina, but in Jubail. But comfort food, so even though this is a methanol company, it's in a town with lots of petroleum employees and people with those sorts of skills. So you have a lot of Texans in Saudi Arabia. And so when you look at the American section, and I don't know if any of these people are from Texas or just did a stint at a petroleum company in Texas, and so they now have opinions very different than mine about chili. I didn't check to see if any of these have beans like good chili does. No, they're all Texas chili, so no beans. But not everyone goes abroad just trying to pretend they're back in the States. So cooking in Ecuador, and then Amway cooking capers is from Venezuela. Both, I think, from the 1950s. So in Ecuador, my guess is conch ceviche is not there because it's comfort food. It's because people wanted to learn good, interesting food that's local. And again, a lot of these cookbooks are bilingual, but not all. And they're bilingual for different reasons. Some in the introduction will talk about how you can look at a recipe and then point to it in the other language so your cook can make that recipe for you. If they don't know what lasagna is, just point to the lasagna recipe and have them read in their own language. And others are because work environments are diverse enough that they're multilingual, and so people will have friends whose preferred language is different than their own. But being bilingual alone doesn't tell you the intended purpose of the book. And in Venezuela, again, on that great fusion dish, iguana a la king, which is combining a whole bunch of different things. So what do we have tonight? Iguana pie, smothered iguana, or iguana a la king? Iguana a la king, just sometimes there's a dish that looks like, oh, if the ingredients were easy to get, I might want to make that to see if it's any good. Another Venezuelan book. This one has been through, I think, 5 editions or so. But then there are things that are both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. So tamales, but Venezuelan style, that are different than what most of the expats would have seen before they came to Venezuela, that is. Back to camels. There is more than one book called Camel Land Cookery. This particular one, Dorothy Short wrote it in Afghanistan in 1964. And although I knew it would take too much time, the cookbooks of expats in Afghanistan are particularly interesting. Partly it's a fairly limited time period that they exist over, from 1964 to 1980. And then there's one from the late 80s that's based on someone's memories of having lived there. But even in that 15-year period, attitudes changed. A book from the late 70s would not be called Camel Land Cookery, even though she includes some local dishes, none for camel. And there's the cookbook from Desert Storm. I don't know I can make an intelligent or intelligible comment about that image. Again, so this is one book called The Stuffed Camel, just on the first page of a different book called The Stuffed Camel. And that particular stuffed camel recipe is in at least a dozen books, mostly but not all from Saudi Arabia. And these are what I call humorous recipes. They're not intended to be cooked. And very often the way you can tell is just add up the amount of food. So a lamb and 20 chickens would be enough to feed 80 people before you stuff that all into a camel. That this is not to feed 80 to 100 people. But my favorite sentence is, broil in large oven or near a gas flare until brown. It's the Saudi version from the petroleum fields that has the gas flare being an acceptable cooking implement. But the same recipe with only 5 or 10 words different exists in many places. But it is not a recipe that can be cooked, let alone that you would want to. It's not 100 gallons of water, it's 110. Someone's thinking in metric. Yeah, so here's the recipe in more, just to make it a little easier to read. So it's gallons of water, but kilos of rice. Okay. And another couple of books with camel recipes, but not all camel recipes are humorous. Oh, no, this is for elephant recipes. So from Syria, Almost Hummus is from a group in Damascus, and Delights of the Desert is from Saudi Arabia. But they have the elephant recipes because, and again, the rabbits are optional only if extra people show up, because most people do not like to find hair in their stew. Not all the recipes warn you that cutting the elephant into bite-sized beats will take 2 weeks. Another recipe says it takes 4 months to cut up an elephant. Maybe they use larger elephants. And they bother specifying not just cook over a fire, cook over a kerosene fire. These recipes are interesting in the amount of detail. Oh, one's got a typo. On the right, instead of 465 degrees, it says 456. But with the same joke at the end. Right. Oh, and notice that to make Play-Doh, if you think your kids are going to eat it, make sure you boil the water and sift the flour so they don't get insects. And in Kuwait, oh no, this is from Syria, but it's camel a la Kuwait. Most of the jokes are about people from somewhere else. That's the nature of things. But that recipe I've never tried stuffing chickens into a camel, but I know that you can't fit 50 chickens and 3 sheep into a camel. I don't need to have done it. And then they use the other stuffed camel recipe, which is back to the one we saw before. It's that second one that we see at least a dozen times. And the recipes travel. So that American Women's Club of Zambia, this is not the same group that put out that 1969 one with the green cover. A decade or two later, put out this one that has the same recipe with the same lame joke and the same oven temperature. Oh no, this one, instead of saying it takes 4 weeks to cut up the elephant, that's how long you cook it. But not all camel recipes are jokes. So the American Women's Club, the bottom you can't see, this is from 1971 in Mogadishu. There's a roast camel recipe that makes sense and pointing out options to do it with kebabs. Pot roast for smaller amounts. These are just recipes because camel is just food. And then what's comfort food or exotic food isn't always simple, and sometimes people are interested in the relationship between those. So in 1950, the Women's Auxiliary of the Jewish Community of the Philippines put together a cookbook that, not surprisingly, has a recipe for gefilte fish, a very standard recipe for gefilte fish. And again, great ads in 1950. But the next page has a recipe for stuffed bangus. Bangus is also called milkfish. It's basically a common fish in the Philippines. But if you read this recipe, and I didn't have the word bangus in it, it's very, very similar to the older gefilte. Gefilte in Yiddish means stuffed. And originally, gefilte fish was bone a fish, make meatballs out of the meat, stuff it back into the skin, and then cook it. And so gefilte fish was stuffed fish, almost exactly the same as this stuffed milkfish recipe. And so the Jewish community in Manila realized these two recipes belong together. They didn't offer commentary. I don't have the volume of Talmud that goes with this. But then there are things that maybe say more about me than say about the people in these communities. So the one on the left is the Karachi cookery book, and it's from the Indian Red Cross because this book was published months before partition. There's an inscription in it from like the spring of 1947, and later that year, India split and Karachi became Pakistani. And Desert Treasures is from Saudi Arabia in the early 80s. And both of these are in Muslim countries or Muslim areas, and there are pork recipes. So I'm glad to hear from the tone of a few people in the room that I was not the only person surprised to see that. I did not know the pork would be available in Karachi or Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is more surprising because of the amount of control the government has over so many things. So like when alcohol was completely illegal in Saudi Arabia, Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Company, used to give out a photocopy of a pamphlet to their employees called The Blue Flame that I frequently am working on getting even a PDF of a photocopy of the original, since all the originals are photocopies, and I have not been successful. But I've seen things about it, so I know it was largely how to distill booze in your garage. And there's a section on how to make it, a section on safety, and safety means both how to make sure you don't make methanol and kill yourself, and also how to make sure you don't blow up your garage and kill yourself. And then all the instructions of, you can drink this, you can give it to your friends, you cannot give it to any Saudi national, you cannot sell it outside of the expat camp. And in fact, Aramco brats, that is kids who grew up in families of Aramco employees, had a website which up until about 6 months before I started searching for it, had this document on it. Aramco offered to the Brats organization, why run your own website? We'll host it for you. And they migrated the content, but deleted some stuff, the stuff that the oil company no longer likes to admit they used to be involved in. Cooking with Flair, which is from 1984, also from Saudi Arabia. It's interesting. First off, with the bizarre font of IWG being pseudo-Arabic, and I don't really know what to make of some of the pseudo-Arabic fonts, Roman fonts that I've seen. This one's interesting because you both have pork chop recipe and what they're calling frittata with pork, but also with a serious camel in a crock pot recipe. And the first hint that this is a real recipe, not a joke, is it starts with 1 kilogram of camel, not 1 medium camel. And I mean, if you just change the word camel to beef, this would be pot roast. And so it also makes it clear that the communities are diverse in every sense of the word, in attitudes about food, about people. This next one from Saudi Arabia, KKIA is King Khalid International Airport. In Saudi Arabia, when they want to build an airport, they build a little village and import 5,000 to 10,000 foreign experts in construction, electronics, whatever. And very often, these places, these communities exist for 3 to 7 years. And then something changes once I think running the airport is different, but to build an airport, and there are at least 4 airports in Saudi Arabia from which there are cookbooks right around the construction dates. So this one's interesting because the pozole recipe on the bottom is one of the few where you see someone explicitly talking about, this is a pork recipe, but I'm using beef here. And not explicitly talking about, is it because I couldn't get it or because it would be inappropriate. I'm going to try to rush through a few things. Cooking in Iran, from 1972. The introduction says something about, so like right in the middle, some recipes are brought from other countries which are part of the international life we lead. And so some people are bringing recipes from so-called home, but there are also often recipes that tell you where people have been posted previously. Another airport cookbook that, and again here in the middle, the Jeddah Airport Circle adhere to the philosophy, we are one group representative of all nations and peoples that live on the KAIA expatriate camp. And that's one of those temporary, but 7 years, you get to know people. Gertrude Jolly, on the other hand, this is a 1950 book where she lived I know she worked in Palestine during the Mandate era and then also in Lebanon. I believe this was published when she lived in Beirut. But she had spent 9 years learning the food, and sort of like May Beattie's book, well, more so than May Beattie's book. This one is a mix, but the local recipes are good, they're accurate. The book's also bilingual without her discussing who she sees as the audience for the book. But excellent recipes. This one, which I think is from the 1980s, is a different approach from a very different group, American, or international, mainly American women, and just theme dinners, but the titles tell you something about who these people are. So down at the bottom, meet my new boss, home leaves over, last minute company dinner, kids are back in school, that one's a lunch. And then I think I've got another season, the Maid's Night In, 12 people. And notice that's the biggest group. I guess that means if you have the maid helping you cook, but I'm not sure. The ambassador is coming for dinner. That's not what most of these cookbooks would have. The board meeting in Tokyo, formal dinner for 8. And then some things that I don't totally understand. So this is Marine Officers' Wives in Okinawa in 1986. And the table of contents lists the Mexican culinary terms section in an American military cookbook. And sure enough, it's not a joke, it is just Mexican culinary terms. And is it because of how many of the families were bilingual, and so the recipes they are going to contribute include Spanish? I'm going to skip some. Japan during the occupation seems like it was an odd place, to use a technical term. This is from 1951 in Okinawa. And again, this is something where at the bottom you see foreign flights and fancies. So there's a section of foreign recipes, but foreign includes the Italian type of spaghetti, and there's only a couple of Japanese dishes. This one I will skip. But again, there's Johnny Marzetti. Johnny Marzetti shows up at number 86, right above ham a la Coke. And this one includes instructions for your Japanese servants in what strikes me as very condescending instructions on how to care for children, as if these housekeepers had never seen children. In which case, would you want to hire a caregiver for your kids who doesn't know anything about kids? Like, if someone needed to be told all these things, I don't know you'd want to hire them as the person to take care of your kids. This one is particularly interesting. Came out in 1948 by a Japanese publishing house, then taken over by Charles Tuttle, who was co-headquartered in Japan and Vermont for 50 years and published books about Asia for Americans for the most part. This book came out in 1948, was still in print in 1972 with very few changes. I find it hard to imagine that anything relevant about living in Japan in 1948 was still relevant in 1972. 15 printings. None of them were big. It's not a common book. But one of the most striking things is, during the occupation, the dedication was, this book is of the women of the occupation, by the women of the occupation, for the women of the occupation. And unfortunately, what you can't read is, at the end it says, the ladies of the, oh, now they're ladies, of the American community, by the American community, for the American community, and the last line says, and their Japanese friends. But during the occupation, it did not occur to anyone that the spouses of the military occupying forces could have Japanese friends. And they also needed to warn, these are things not to let near children. And it doesn't matter whether the furnace is electric, gas, or coal. No matter what makes it hot, don't let the kids near it. This is another book. This was put out by a Union church A multi-denominational Christian church in Tokyo. Their first edition of this book was 1954. I've seen copies as recent as 1973. So again, although it's not a book of the occupation, still, that 20-year period, the American experience in Japan was very, very different. But the book didn't change much. And the Oriental section isn't even, the majority of it isn't even Japanese. And I added this just because we have enough people here from Detroit that in the section of how to cook for a crowd, how to make coney sauce for 100 people, but it's not authentic because it does not include heart. And the question of who is an expat view as people living abroad could be viewed as expat no matter why they are abroad, by choice or not by choice. This book was put out because some of the women in the Theresienstadt concentration camp fantasized about having food, and so they wrote out recipes. And they did not have butter, they did not have cream. These recipes were never cooked. This was how they cooked. Another kind of person who some people could see as an expat. This book was printed in the mid-30s. I've not been able, none of the people who are confident of the date of its publication have been able to explain it in a way that convinces me that their confidence is deserved. Could be 1933, could be 1936. It was published by WISO, Women's International Zionist Organization of London. So they were Zionist, and they were trying to get German Jews to move to Palestine. And so and what I don't know is how many of these people thought of themselves as immigrants, how many of them thought of themselves as refugees, how many people wanted to go back to Germany when the war ended, if the war ended. And because the organization had a different idea about why people should move to Palestine than many of the individuals did, the intentions, what's in the book doesn't tell me what's in the mind of the people they were serving. But this book could be useful to academics for certain projects. So the introduction says things like, you're living in a hot place now. You need to think more about eggplant and what we would call zucchini and less about cabbage and stews. And the book is trilingual. English, German, and Hebrew. It's not Yiddish. Because again, this was a Zionist organization. They wanted people to learn Hebrew and have that be the language of what became Israel. Another really complex book is Rankin's American Cookbook for India from the 30s and 40s. There are a couple, there's an edition from the early 30s and an edition from 1944. And she had these complex ideas about race and gender, and doesn't use the phrase global south, but sort of talks about something related to that concept about that's at least one academic has tried to analyze her book with modern thought. And I will leave you with one of my favorite book covers and one of my favorite title pages, 1930s American Women's Club in Bombay and in Saudi Arabia in 1975. So, and if we have time for questions, I will take them. Do we have any time for questions? I'm sorry for...
Yes, we have a good 10 minutes.
Oh, okay, great.
And I have one from the live stream. Someone asks, is there an institution in the United States who will accept donations of expat books?
That is a question I am working on right now. I have around 1,600. I'm still collecting, but it's at I have the critical mass that, at least one academic has asked to use the collection. If that person wants to get in touch with me, I'm glad to talk to them. I don't know if you can get their name or.
Yeah,
My name is
figure it
fairly
out.
unique. If you Google me, you tend to find me.
Okay.
There are no other Dan Freiduses.
Are there any questions from the room? Great.
Dan, first, thanks. This is great to see how the collection has grown and what's happened. As you have created this market, has the market sort of risen up to meet you? Are there, I'm thinking both of availability, but also price. Now that people know you want this stuff, and kind of building on the question that you had from the online folks, I know collecting is an end in itself, but have you begun to think about what's going to happen with your collection once once the interest has gotten there and someone wants to start to work with it, besides the work you've done with it?
Thanks, Garrett. I've thought a little bit about, one of the things is, the reason I would like to see it in an institution is a grad student or even most faculty members don't have the time or money to travel to 20 libraries, even if these books are in libraries. And a significant chunk of my collection is not in any library anywhere. But having them in one place, because the other thing is, whoever institution that has them, they're not going to all get digitized. That's, at least right now, that would be too expensive. But there are people who could access an online catalog, know that a trip to Ann Arbor or East Lansing or NYU or some institution would be worth their time. And so that's my hope. As far as the market, I did make a brief comment about some people who think rare means valuable. Rarity is a component to it, but demand makes a difference. And very few people have directly offered me books at prices higher than I would have seen 5 years ago because I'm collecting. That said, I think there are dealers who focus more on supply and others who focus more on demand. So some people see an obscure book. The Ghana Chop book, I paid $3 for that one in an open shop, although an open shop run by a very knowledgeable person who you know, because I think they rightfully realized it might sit on their shop for years. They wanted to make sure the price was low enough that if someone cares about it, they wanted that person to go home with it. But I've also seen books that literally were priced at 10 times what I thought they were worth. And most of those I do not own.
Great.
Having been in the Peace Corps and as an exchange student and lived in later life in other countries, one of the things about these kinds of cookbooks is that many people forget to take a cookbook with them when they move to other countries. And so they're invaluable for the people when they arrive.
Oh, yeah. There are a huge number of cookbooks that have recipes for white bread.
Right, exactly.
Or staples that either people thought they could just, at home they always bought in stores so they never needed a recipe, or recipes that are so basic, you just look it up if you need to remember the ratios. So yeah.
But the other thing is, Peace Corps people are generally 20, 25. They don't know how to cook.
Right.
And when I was 16, as an exchange student, I didn't know how to make a pumpkin pie from pumpkin. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you what, it's terrible when you try to do it. Ugh.
Yeah.
So,
The,
anyway, yeah,
there are study abroad cookbooks that, again, meant for people who are young and have never cooked at all, and that's part of the theme. Mormon books for, how to cook when you're on mission, and they know they're talking about 18-year-olds the first time they've left home.
Hi, I really appreciated this presentation because I wasn't in the Peace Corps, but I got a research grant years ago when I was much younger, and I spent 4 years in India. Now I was already an immigrant from India in this country and then went back. And it was my time to myself, like kind of exploring it on my own without family, and I got to see a lot more. What I liked about this presentation was that you saw the view from expats. Maybe this is beyond the scope of your presentation, but I was wondering if you would ever think about kind of writing something about how their view of food and their introduction, reflects how we look at food from abroad now, like how it shaped how we look at food from abroad now, like pre all these, cooking shows and travel shows, and how it might have influenced that as well. Because in my apartment, I stopped counting after over 200 cookbooks.
Uh-huh.
I don't think any of them are really rare, but a lot of them I got abroad, some I got here. I'm overwrought with them. But when I look at a recipe, even before I look at the recipes, I look at what the author wrote, what motivated them, the history of the food. I look up a recipe and I try and Google what's the history of that recipe, the origin, particular regions. My specialty is South Asia. And so, having been almost through the entire country of India, I've seen how different regions, why they differ, how they differ, and how different communities influenced, for instance, Jews in South India, how did they influence the food in South India as well as in Bombay, just as an example.
Yeah.
Or the Parsis, for instance.
Right. Just in India, that could be the subject of a lot of study. But I know in the U.S., I think food has definitely been influenced both by immigrants and by returning expats. And I think because people don't just go abroad randomly. There are certain countries that get many more expats or many more returnees. And so I think certain things enter our cuisine differently because of those patterns of both expat experiences and migration. And then, of course, there's the deliberate things like the Thai government setting up a development program for Thai expats and immigrants to set up Thai restaurants. You can buy a business package on how to set up a Thai restaurant. And if you've ever thought about how, for many years, all the Thai restaurants seemed to be the same, because it was the middle of the three business plans. There was the casual one, the semi-casual, and the fancy one. And the really cheap and the really expensive, very few restaurants were open. And in the middle, there were a couple hundred in the US, and they all used the same business plan.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question, and I saw your hand up earlier.
Hi, this was really fun. From the top of your encyclopedic head, do you happen to recall if you have a Chamorro cookbook from Guam that has fruit bat and unhatched chick recipes?
So I have not noticed unhatched chick recipes in any of my books. I think I would have. I have a couple of Guamanian cookbooks, one of which would not have those things in it, one of which I would have to look. But I do have a couple of recipes from an expat who lived in Palau for a while that has bat recipes that I could give you info if you want to talk. I own one of the bat cookbooks.
And unhatched chick was very popular.
I'd have to look in Philippine cookbooks to see if it shows up there. Balut? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we could We
Okay.
could talk for another half hour at least.
Thank you all very much.